One.
Welcome to The Cutting Edge with Dr. Lee Pierson and Dr. Robert Stubblefield. I'm Steve Richins, and on today's show, we have a special guest, Dr. Shoshan Milgram, a scholar in the good sense and a professor at Virginia Tech. She's a professor of literature, and she's an expert on Ayn Rand. And we are here to talk about Howard Roark, the thinker, and what it means to be morally and psychologically, what integrity means. I think I'm going off script there a little bit. So, but what it means for Howard Roark, the architect, to be a thinker. So I'll turn it over to Shoshana, unless Lee has.
I'll just turn it. I think we should turn it right over to her. Thank you. Thanks, Steve.
Okay. Thanks to all of you, and thanks to everybody's listening. And I am indeed going to talk about Howard Roark as a thinker. Now, we all know who is John Galt, and one of the important things we know about him is that he is a thinker. He's a man of reason. And I've even heard objectivists say that Ayn Rand did not make thinking important in the Fountainhead, and that she saved this theme for what she called her novel about the mind, which was Atlas Shrugged. Well, I beg to differ, and I'm going to start by answering the question of who is Howard Roark, because there are several answers to that question. He is, of course, an architect. Boy, is he an architect. We're told that he'd walk over corpses, any and all of them, but he'd be an architect. His work done his way, that, he tells us, is all he is. He's not just a protagonist, he's a hero. He's an inspiration. But along with all of that, and at the root of all that, Howard Roark is a thinker, and it's my mission today to call your attention to the way the novel presents him as being a thinker. I'm going to talk about what it means morally and psychologically for Howard Roark to be a thinker. I'm going to ask you to think about the way Howard Roark thinks. You see, we all know that Atlas Shrugged is about the volitional character of reason, but so is the Fountainhead. Now, Steve mentioned integrity, and we all know about Roark from the standpoint of his cardinal virtue, integrity. Nothing within him is in conflict with anything else fundamentally. He's all of a piece. He's a whole man. And there's a nice sequence in the Fountainhead when Dominique asks, after not having seen Roark for a while, asks Steve Mallory how Roark is. And Steve Mallory basically says, as he's always been, he doesn't change, you know. And then he says, other people die with every day that passes. When you meet them, they're not what you met last. In any given hour, they kill some part of themselves. They change, they deny, they contradict, and they call it growth. How do they expect, this is still Steve, a permanence which they've never held for a single moment? But Howard, one can imagine him existing forever. So what's that about? What does it mean for him to exist forever, to kill no part of himself, to refuse to change, to refuse to deny, to refuse to contradict? What does it mean for him to have permanence, to be as he's always been? Well, in the Fountainhead, what that means is that he can hold an idea and stand by it. And now I'm going to give you two very important sentences from the Fountainhead, and they come from Kent Lansing. And this is what he says. It's in part 2, chapter 10. He says, integrity is the ability to stand by an idea. That presupposes the ability to think. Now, if you didn't have those sentences marked, you should mark them now, because that's really important. That's what integrity is, standing by an idea. It's not about being stubborn. It's not about standing against other people. It's not being a nonconformist. It's standing by an idea. And thinking, standing by an idea, is something that one does alone. It's the act of an individual. And we know all about this from the Fountainhead. And I'm just going to quote you a little bit from Roark himself when he voices that. He keeps talking about the mind. Man cannot survive except through his mind. To plant, he needs a process of thought. To hunt, he needs weapons, and to make weapons, a process of thought. From the simplest necessity to the highest religious abstraction, from the wheel to the skyscraper, everything we are and everything we have comes from a single attribute of man, the function of his reasoning mind. You see, Roark is talking about this explicitly. He's naming it. And then he goes on, the mind is an attribute of the individual. There is no such thing as a collective brain. There is no such thing as a collective thought. The primary act, the process of reason, must be performed by each man alone. Okay, that's from part 4, chapter 18. So the core of Howard Roark, the function of his reasoning mind, the primary act, the process of reason, that's at the core of Howard Roark. So what do we see him within the novel doing as a thinker? Well, what he does is that he identifies what's important and he holds on to it against temptation, against distraction, against diversion, against dilution. Now, we all know the dramatic episode of the Manhattan Bank building. It's a favorite. And that, of course, is about a thought. It's important that the building express the one single thought he gave it. Its integrating principle, the one thought that created it. Nothing is more important than that. He is, in fact, standing by the idea that the building itself has an idea, the idea that created it. You could say he's showing integrity about integrity. And in fact, he puts forth effort to stand by his idea. He speaks, he explains, he stands up, and he holds on to the table. And I'm going to quote now from the novel, part 1, chapter 15. He explained why an honest building like an honest man had to be of one piece and one faith. What constituted the life source, the idea in any existing thing or creature, and why if one smallest part committed treason to that idea, the thing or the creature was dead, and why the good, the high, and the noble on earth was only that which kept its integrity. Okay? There he is, talking about an idea, talking about holding on to the idea. But that's the way that he thinks all the time. He figures out what's important and he holds on to that. And here's another example, which is in certain ways not the famous one, but I think it's quite powerful. And this is when he explains to Stephen Mallory why he came to Mallory to hire him as a sculptor for the Stoddard Temple. And Mallory is carrying on. Mallory is up to all sorts of utter nonsense. He's rude. He's uttering foolishness. And Roark just cuts through all of that. He dismisses as ridiculous all the foolishness that Mallory utters. And he instead states very clearly the actual reason that brought him to Mallory's apartment in order to hire a sculptor to convey the human ideal. And I'm quoting now, "You're a goddamn fool. You have no right to care what I think of your work, why I'm here, what I am or why I'm here. You're too good for that. But if you want to know, I think you're the best sculptor we've got. I think it because your figures are not what men are, but what men could be and should be. Because you've gone beyond the probable and made us see what is possible, but possible only through you. Because your figures are more devoid of contempt for humanity than any work I've ever seen, and because you have a magnificent respect for the human being, because your figures are the heroic in man." And he knows about that, of course. And so I didn't come here to do you a favor, or because I felt sorry for you, or because you need a job pretty badly. He just brushes all that aside. I came here for a simple, selfish reason. The same reason that makes a man choose the cleanest food he can find. It's the law of survival, isn't it? To seek the best. I didn't come for your sake. I came for mine. So he is completely clear. He identifies it. He sticks to it. That's why he's there. He wants his meaning to be clear. He uses his mind. He sees what matters most. He sticks to it. He lives by it. Nothing comes between him and his idea. So we see Roark at the Manhattan Bank building. We see Roark here. He's got the idea and he knows what he thinks and he lives what he thinks. Now, in the novel, it's a long novel, Peter Keating, we know, is a foil to Howard Roark. Peter Keating is a second-hander. He's concerned, as Harry Binswanger says, with folks instead of with facts. And, you know, Peter Keating, Roark, they start out contrasted with each other in the first part of the novel, but all the way through, we see that Howard Roark takes a look and Peter Keating takes a poll. But Peter Keating is also a contrast from the standpoint of not being able to stand by an idea. In part 3, chapter 2, there's a scene in which Dominique sees Keating on the verge of understanding something he'd not known, on the verge of understanding that the soul is real only when it's independent. He begins to understand that this is true, the idea, and he begins to understand that he has lived as if he did not have a soul. And I'm quoting now, she, Dominique, looked down at his face resting against her knees, and he saw pity in her eyes. And for one moment, he knew what a dreadful thing true pity is, but he kept no knowledge of it because he slammed his mind shut before the words in which he was about to preserve it. Okay, slams his mind shut. He's almost got it. He's got it for a minute, and then he slams his mind shut. Then she kisses his forehead. He kisses her hand, and she says to him, Peter, if you could hold on to it, to what you are now. And then he says he loves her, and they sit together silently. And then you remember what happens. The telephone rings, and he is ruined by the bell, or rather ruined by the way he loses hold when he answers the phone. Quote, it was not the sound that destroyed the moment. It was the eagerness with which Keating jumped up and ran to answer it, unquote. Well, it's Ellsworth Toohey. It would be. And that's the end of Peter's being able to hold on to what he was at that moment. And now, sort of to accompany what I've been telling you about the Fountainhead, I want to leave the Fountainhead for a few minutes and to look at a psychologist's description of the process of thought in moral and psychological terms. And I'll be looking at the psychological writings of William James, who is a very bad philosopher, but a very great psychologist. And I suspect that something here is going to sound familiar. I'm going first to his talks to teachers on psychology, chapter 15, and this is James. If then you are asked, in what does a moral act consist? When reduced to its simplest and most elementary form, you can make only one reply. You can say that it consists in the effort of attention by which we hold fast to an idea which, but for that effort of attention, would be driven out of the mind by the other psychological tendencies that are there. To think, in short, is the secret of will, just as it is the secret of memory. In all this, the power of voluntarily attending is the point of the whole procedure. Just as a balance turns on its knife edges, so on it our moral destiny turns. And now I'm going to look at the longer treatment and the principles of psychology. Also the chapter on will, where he says the essential achievement of the will, in short, when it is most voluntary, is to attend to a difficult object and hold it fast before the mind. Everywhere, then, the function of the effort is the same, to keep affirming and adopting a thought which if left to itself would slip away. To think, in short, is in short the only moral act. To sum it all up in a word, the terminus of the psychological process in volition, the point to which the will is directly applied, is always an idea. There are at all times some ideas from which we shy away like frightened horses the moment we get a glimpse of their forbidding profile upon the threshold of our thought. The only resistance which our mind can possibly experience is the resistance which such an idea offers to being attended to at all. To attend to it is the volitional act and the only inward volitional act which we ever perform. And then he says, once again, I put the thing in this ultra simple way because I want more than anything else to emphasize the fact that volition is primarily a relation not between ourself and extra-mental matter, as many philosophers still maintain, but between ourself and our own states of mind. Volition, for James, is about thinking. And now I'm going to give you a little more to show that James understands that a thinker is a hero and a hero is a thinker. And as you listen, you got to picture Roark holding on to the table as he stands up to explain one more time why the building is a whole, and he cannot surrender the Manhattan Bank building, cannot agree to a compromised version of his design. He insists on his idea, nothing else, nothing less, no matter what the cost. And he knows and faces what the cost is. And here's, picture Roark, but here's James. The huge world that girdles us about puts all sorts of questions to us and tests us in all sorts of ways. Some of the tests we meet by actions that are easy, and some of the questions we answer in articulately formulated words. But the deepest question that is ever asked admits of no reply, but the turning of the will and the tightening of our heartstrings as we say, yes, I will even have it so. When a dreadful object is presented, or when life as a whole turns up its dark abysses to our view, then the worthless ones among us lose their hold on the situation altogether and either escape from its difficulties by averting their attention, or if they cannot do that, collapse into yielding masses of plaintiveness and fear. The effort required for facing and consenting to such objects is beyond their power to make. But the heroic mind acts differently. To it too, the objects are sinister and dreadful, unwelcome, incompatible with wished-for things, but it can face them if necessary, without for that losing its hold upon the rest of life. I'm almost finished here. The world thus finds in the heroic man its worthy match and mate, and the effort which he's able to put forth to hold himself erect and keep his heart unshaken is the direct measure of his worth and function in the game of human life. He can stand this universe. He can meet it and keep his faith in it in presence of those same features which lay his weaker brethren low. He can still find a zest in it, not by ostrich-like forgetfulness, but by pure inward willingness to face the world with those deterrent objects there, and thereby he becomes one of the masters and lords of life. He must be counted with henceforth. He becomes a part of human destiny. So he holds fast to an idea, and when he thinks, he inspires others in fiction and in fact. And I've got one more passage from the Fountainhead, which you're probably thinking of. It's the beginning of, near the beginning of part 4. The description from Steve Mallory of the building of Monadic Valley, the architect who walked among them, down the snow or the grass of the hillsides, over the boulders and the piled planks, to the drafting tables, to the derricks, to the tops of rising walls, the man who had made this possible, the thought in the mind of that man, and not the content of that thought, nor the result, nor the vision that had created Monadic Valley, nor the will that had made it real, but the method of his thought, the rule of its function, the method and rule which were not like those of the world beyond the hills. That stood on guard over the valley and over the crusaders within it. And last word from William James again, we draw new life from the heroic example. The hero is drunk more deeply than anyone of the cup of bitterness, but his countenance is so unshaken, and he speaks such mighty words of cheer, that his will becomes our will, and our life is kindled at his own. So that's it for now. And now you can ask me questions or comment as you wish.
Well, that was brilliant to put hold fast and Roark holding the table and holding as integrity an idea. You already gave us so much spiritual fuel. I love that. Thank you, Shoshana.
And thank you. But, Ayn Rand does all the work. I just read her, and once I start reading, it's right there. But of course, that's part of the joy of reading over and over, is that you get more out of what you read. So, it's thank you, Steve, but it's Ayn Rand, I think.
You get
What
credit
else?
for selectivity.
Okay.
Well, let me talk for a moment about William James, or ask about William James, which, as you know, I'm a great advocate of James. I think he is in a certain context. He is, in my opinion, by far the greatest psychologist that has ever lived. I can't think of anybody that compares to him. Not even my mentor, James Gibson, is in his class. But as a philosopher, he's one of the worst. He's one of the founders of pragmatism, which is something of a paradox. And I detect something of that paradox a bit in the material that you read about the hero. Not so much from, what chapter was it? I've quoted this many times from talks to teachers. Is it chapter 15 or is it chapter 11? It doesn't matter. Anyway, I've quoted from that, as you know, many times. The other section you read from, principles about the hero. There, I think we can detect. I mean, it's an excellent passage overall, but it seems to me there is a bit of the malevolent universe premise, at least implicitly in some of that material. He refers to attention to the sinister and the dreadful. and that's the almost defining characteristic. Now, how would that apply to Roark? What Roark does is when Toohey comes up to him and says, "What do you think of me?" and he says, I don't think of you." So he doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about any more than necessary, any more than the tiniest bit necessary, thinking about the sinister and dreadful. And I think in the world of Roark, although there are things that are sinister and dreadful, for example, Elkworth Toohey, he doesn't spend much time thinking about them at all. That's not the primary usage of his free will. I mean, he does spend a lot of time. This is not sinister, dreadful exactly, but there is the principle behind the dean, and he does spend a lot of time off stage thinking about the principle behind the dean, or maybe on stage too. Wanted to ask you about that as well, because that is a thought process that continues throughout the novel. Is he doesn't understand what's going on with the dean, what the hell's going on with this guy, and eventually he figures it out. And there is a thought process, and I think that thought process is mostly off stage. But maybe Shoshana, you can say something. So I guess I'll stop there with those two things for the moment. The malevolent universe, which, by the way, let me venture something. I'm not certain about this, but because I wasn't prepared to speak about James's metaphysics, the metaphysics of pragmatism, if that's not a contradiction in terms that they have such. Whatever it is, it's some kind of inchoate something not does not in any full sense possess identity. The universe of a pragmatist, and for that reason, it would be a sinister and dreadful world. The world as a pragmatist sees it is a sinister and dreadful world. I think that's true. So maybe that goes some way to explaining James. I'm not sure. Well, he also the cup of bitterness. Now there certainly is a cup of bitterness. There is bitterness in Fountainhead. There is, Roark has to go to the quarry. He doesn't succeed immediately as he would deserve to. You might think, but it's not like he drinks deeply from the cup of bitterness. He experiences it, but it's not. The pain only goes down to a certain level, as it were. So how about all that? I'll stop there.
Okay. All right. Well, for a start, I think the fact that James identifies that there are bad things in the world, that's true. And the hero can say, yes, I don't have to pretend it's not there, but it's the storm, not me, that's going to blow away. That's not going to defeat me. And I think that when Roark says, but I don't think of you, well, that's what he's telling Toohey, because it's exactly what Toohey doesn't want to hear. Who Toohey wants to be real in Roark's eyes, and Roark is not going to give him that. And it is right. And why should he tell him that? Why should he tell him anything? It is true that he does think about Toohey, as we know. He's identified certain things about him, et cetera. And when he has his big conversation out on the yacht with Winand, he knows who Toohey is, but he doesn't think he needs to think about Toohey any longer than is necessary to deal with him. Now, if someone told him that Toohey was actually coaching Hopton Stoddard, well, that would make a difference. But in general, I think he goes with what Galt says in Atlas Shrugged. It's not that I don't suffer, but I know the meaninglessness of suffering. Never think of pain or suffering longer than is necessary to fight it. And sometimes you can't fight things unless you understand them. So I think that's how the negative stuff fits in. And it is true that when James is talking, he is talking about the heroism of going on in spite of, and yet without ignoring difficult things that others would not think about. He's not actually talking about creation, by the way. And that is the side of that certainly is part of, that's one thing that you need to do as a thinker in creating, is to have an idea of building something and to stick to that and to defend it, whatever. So I think that's kind of how the negative stuff fits in with what James says, and is also, I think, consistent with Roark. Now, you were asking about the principle behind the dean, and well, I'm sure you know the answer to that. Roark is always better at thinking about himself and about the granite and about building things than about figuring out what in the world is going on with people who are not like me. He knows they're not like him. What can explain that? And it's not as if he's planning to run for election and needs to know how to make those people vote for him or anything, but he's curious. He wants to understand what the fundamental difference is. He's got to start on that. Stephen Mallory pushes him a little further because Stephen Mallory talks about the beast. Stephen Mallory talks about why he shot Toohey. He knows everything about the beast. And Roark brings back the principle of the dean. He's talking with Stephen Mallory, as part of that conversation. But the place where it shows up again and kind of decisively is when Winand and Roark are on sabbatical, right? They're on vacation, they're on the yacht, which is an argument for going on sabbatical and having time to think about things, that neither one is directly engaged in their work, and they're talking about things. And the funny thing is you probably noticed if you've looked at that chapter, it's almost as if the two of them are saying the same things. You kind of have to keep track of who's talking, except of course that when Winand gets around to talking about what he thinks he's done with sacrificing himself and that is it selfish and so on, and Roark hears that, and now he's finally got the whole thing. That's sort of and remember Winand says, why are you why are you looking like that? Well, he's looking like that because everything finally came into place for him, and Roark turns away and doesn't want to tell Winand because that's not how he works. He doesn't want to tell Winand directly, you've just named yourself as being a kind of second-hander. What he says is, you weren't born to be a second-hander. And it says Winand just hears that. He doesn't hear the rest of it, because you weren't born to be a second-hander also means, but look what happened to you anyway, which Roark has finally understood. So that's how he's finally got to the end of it. And he also right there talks about the positive, the self-sufficient ego, and that's the right name for, he says, selfishness, egotism, maybe not the perfect words, but self-sufficient ego, names that this is what he looks for in people, and he says he can see it right away. And that's the opposite of the principle behind the dean, or Dean Ellsworth Toohey, who is an expert in that, more so than the dean. That principle of beast, the collective, which incidentally, as described by Mallory, is of this thing without a mind. That's what's missing. And that's how Roark, as the opposite, he's all about the mind and a thinker, even if he's younger than Galt and doesn't have quite as much to say about the process of thinking, but the thinking itself is very important to him.
So not to go off track, but to pronounce what Winand finds out on the yacht, when Roark stands, the next time they meet is in the courtroom, and when Roark stands, what Winand stands as well. Is that correct?
Well, there's a lot happens in between. They haven't gotten back yet. I mean, hey, a lot of things happen, right? They're out on the yacht. They come back, Cortland. Oops, look what happened there. And then, of course, there's the blowing. Well, Winand sees what's happened, and Dominique is recruited. The hospital, all of that. So a lot of things happen in between the courtroom, but the courtroom that's an important scene that Winand is being judged as well. And as I'm sure you remember, this is Roark doesn't want to pronounce a final verdict on him himself. What you think you've lost can neither be found nor lost. And Winand doesn't want to hear that, doesn't want to talk to him about it.
But he knows in the courtroom that he's lost the hold of what it is to be that hero.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, well, and he knew it when he gave in and he saw that editorial printed with his name on it in his own newspaper condemning Roark. And
Right.
he sees, someone put a footprint on Roark's face, and he says, "Yeah, that's my doing. I did this. That's my soul, exposed," and so on. So it's tragic. And
Yeah.
it's not just that. Well, he understands the full implications of what he did. It's because it's not Roark he betrayed, it's his own soul. Yeah.
Now, I think this is something that has been discussed before, and therefore is not necessarily the best material for the cutting edge, but maybe you have a different something to say about it. You mentioned that Roark said Winan wasn't born to be a second-hander.
Yeah.
Now, does that represent a Nietzschean leftover, or what does that? What do you think that means?
Okay. Well, he's not. He can't formally be a determinist because, in fact, nobody's born to be a second-hander. That wouldn't be fair. Okay. So nobody's actually born to be a second-hander. But I mean, it's a way of saying this is how, although Winan doesn't hear it, this is how you've ended up, and you didn't have to make that choice. So, in fact, that's what he's saying to him. This is what you did, and you didn't have to do that. Which, of course, means if you didn't have to do it, you can make a different choice now.
Yeah. So on that interpretation, Roark could have said that about anyone. Even elsewhere too, he could have said, "Well, you weren't born to be a second-hander." Is that the sense in which you interpret it? I felt it had a little more force as trying to say something about Winan's, dare I use the word innate, Winan's inherent character, something about more than just that he's like everyone else. He can go one way or the other.
Sure. Well, of course, everybody has free will, but I think that it's especially, there's a certain kind of irony there. Look what happened to you. And you did not think that was what you were doing, but look what you did. I think that, with some people fairly early on, you could say, well, this is the direction they're going, even though it's always possible to change course. It could be that there's a little Nietzschean echo in there because, well, the quotation that was going to be at the beginning, and Ayn Rand said that, she liked the spirit of it, even though she didn't like what it said literally.
Yeah.
But I think that even with Winan, it's not as if he started making his mistakes right from the beginning, but that as he started making choices in the direction, well, as you remember, all the things we learned about him in part 3, and he has a certain experience, he reaches a certain conclusion, and even the name of his yacht, you don't run things around here, I do, is an affirmation of his actually being in charge of his life. And he was in charge of his life, including his mistakes. And, something that's happened after he was born. Now, the thing is, you might say, why doesn't Roark try to help Winan out by explaining to him, you shouldn't be doing this, etc.? But that's not Roark's way. I mean, he doesn't have a lot of conversations with Dominique about months and so on about her various errors of thinking. He says things once, but basically it's for her to use her own mind and make her own judgment, and it's going to be like that with Winan also. He's going to have to use his own mind and make his own judgment, as Roark did.
Keying off of what you said, Lee, about the metaphysical premise and malevolent universe, it strikes me that Dagny and Winan and James all had the same malevolent universe.
You mean Dominique? You mean Dominique, right?
Yes.
Yep. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. Yep. Oh, those two novels. Who could keep them straight? And that also explains why James could develop pragmatism. It's because he thinks that you should hold true to your ideas, you should have integrity, but he thinks the universe is against that. And there's so much tempting him to be against that. And so we'll just do what works.
Yeah, that could be. I mean, I'm a little bit hesitant to go too far into speculating what on the psychology of William James. I mean, let's say his personal psychology, but something like that seems reasonable. And his life, I mean, you know, he was kind of a privileged, as a leftist would put it. You know, he had a upper class sort of, or intellectually upper class upbringing, but his life was not so easy. He suffered from depression for a lot of his life, and he came out of the depression, according to what he says himself anyway. He came out by understanding the reality of free will. That's what pulled him out of a state of depression. So anyway, there's something to what you say, Bob. I think there definitely is.
Well, I think that dramatically, it's a good way to point to the fact that sometimes there can be something that makes it hard to hold on to what you think. And there were a couple of passages from Atlas Shrugged I was thinking about that, where Richard Halley says, "Let the world rack him or ruin him, he will not bear false witness to the evidence of his mind." You know, that, and it's not the world's necessarily going to be against you, but it could be. And even if it is, you can hold on to your idea. And Galt says it too. He says in that when he's talking about integrity, and he says that, you know, a person of integrity won't sacrifice his convictions, be it the whole of mankind, shouting pleas or threats against him. And, you know, I guess pleas are not malevolent, but, you know, they're pleading, they're threatening. It doesn't matter. You can hold on to what you think. And that's what Roark does. Now, that's why, you know, every time I would hear people say, well, you know, Atlas Shrugged, that's really the book about thinking. No, this is the book about thinking. You know,
well, there can be more than one book about thinking.
Yeah, yes, that's right. This is one of the books about thinking. This is the first one. Yeah. Okay.
Something I thought you might get into, but you didn't too much. In this book, one of the things that Roark thinks a lot about is the issue of first-handedness versus second-handedness. In fact, that's the principle in the Dean. That's the same thing I was talking about earlier. So not only is he thinking about that idea, but he's exemplifying first-handedness in his thinking about first-handedness. You mentioned integrity about integrity, so there's something similar going on here. And of course, there is a foil. The main foil on this point presented in Atlas in Fountainhead is Roark versus Keating, not Roark versus Toohey, because Toohey in a twisted way is doing a lot of thinking, or something akin to thinking, if it's not exactly thinking. It's something in the ballpark. Now, but Bob's going to point out that it's not like thinking at all. But anyway, there's something going on. I think the clear contrast, the foil, is Keating. You know, Keating is the quintessential example of second-handedness, as against Roark's quintessential first-handedness. And then by the time we get to the end of the novel, or near the end, Roark is actually doing explicit philosophy. I mean, he creates the courtroom speech, which is in part about first-handedness versus second-handedness, but it's actually framed as the creator as against the non-creator. And those are related issues, and certainly they apply. That's part of the distinction. Part of the distinction between Roark and Keating is that Roark is a fundamental creator, and Keating is not. He doesn't create anything except trouble. So that's a part of the distinction. And then that's kind of mixed in, as I see it, it's kind of mixed in with first-handedness and second-handedness. But I think there's a clear distinction there. Maybe the book, and again, Shoshana may, or Bob, or Steve may want to correct me on this. I don't see the distinction being clearly made in the book. Well, there's one exception we'll get to in a moment. Between first-handedness and second-handedness and creative power and, I don't want to call it necessarily parasitism, because there are uncreative people that aren't parasites. In the Fountainhead, that is most clearly exemplified by Mike the electrician, who it's a great character. Mike the electrician is not a creative force, but he's definitely first-handed, and he's definitely moral. But anyway, I see something that's not quite. By the time we get to the speech, he's talking about the creator versus the uncreative, and that is not quite the same as first versus second-handed, or I would argue it isn't. Somebody might argue, I don't know if anybody wants to take this position, that if you are consistently first-handed, you will be able to be as creative as anybody. You can be Leonardo da Vinci or Isaac Newton or Ayn Rand or any number of others if you just consistently practice first-handedness. I think the evidence that we have from psychology on this matter precludes that possibility. There is such a thing as ability, thinking ability, creative ability, different kinds of thinking abilities. And this is probably a topic for us to get back to when if we bring in somebody like Ed Locke, so we can get some of their psychologists besides me to come back to this topic in a more scientific context. But forgetting about the science for a moment, isn't it evident that there is some difference? I mean, Mike the electrician illustrates this difference. He is, as far as I can tell, fully moral and fully first-handed, but he's not going to create buildings like Howard Roark or even do the philosophy. Howard Roark is a philosopher by the end of the book, quite a considerable philosopher, just in that one speech. And we're not going to see that from Mike the electrician. So any comments about first-handedness, second-handedness, and its relation to being a creative fountainhead, a creative fountainhead?
Okay, well, I think as you're saying, there are different pairs and oppositions, and but it's also true that creators and parasites don't cover the territory. Well, I think first-handers and second-handers do. Okay, that if you're a first-hander, you're not a little bit second-handed, although there could be compartmentalization. But so I think there's a difference between those two pairs. It's also true that someone who is not first-handed, I can't quite picture that person being much of a creator. Okay, just saying. Well, so I mean, we're going to start doing diagrams that you'd have to take that into account.
Necessary versus sufficient condition.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Now, I think that it's a mistake that someone could make to think that if you're not an innovator, a creator, that means that you're a zero. That you're ballast or whatever. I don't. That'd be a mistake. I don't think that it's a mistake that we see anybody making in the Fountainhead, because Keating's problem isn't that he lacks ability; it's that he's deficient morally. I'm just saying, that's what's highlighted about him, and he even figures it out. I mean, he figures it out. Of course, he keeps bumping into the truth, and then he picks himself up and hurries on as if nothing had happened. But when he explains it to Katie, he explains it very well. He says, that was something I really wanted to do in my life, and that's a sin that I didn't do what I wanted. That's correct, Peter. Now what are you going to do tomorrow? How are you, what are you going to do tomorrow based on the idea that you need to figure out what you really want and go after that? Okay. he doesn't manage to do that, but he's actually got it there of what it would mean to be first-handed. Now, one could say that what actually draws him to Katie, and now there are various things you could say about that. I don't think that it's not specified, because we're talking about Peter Keating here as the way it would be if someone who has integrity, but nonetheless, from his understanding, he wanted to marry her. He loved her, and he didn't do it. And he failed to do what he wanted for no reason at all, no first-handed reason at all. And he understands that. And the fact that she's now beyond the point where she can hear it, that's her problem. But he does say it. So I think he's a second-hander who manages to get something, just as when he's with Dominique in the scene that I read to you, he actually understands what she's talking about for a minute until the phone rings and it's Ellsworth Toohey again. So yeah, that's first-handed and second-handed, and that's really important. And then there's creative versus parasites versus non-creative. You've got several different things, but Roark needs to make a big point about first-handed versus second-handed, because for one thing, that's a binary, and for another, it's not obvious. I think maybe creator versus non-creator is.
What do you mean by binary? You mean exhaustive? Is that right?
Yeah.
Yep.
It's either or, one or the other.
One or the other. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Exhaustive. No.
I think that's true.
Yeah. So one way of thinking about what I have in mind is, imagine, as a little thought experiment, imagine taking Keating back to whatever it is, probably early in childhood when he first started evading and not thinking, first started not thinking for himself. Imagine that he did think for himself. And imagine that he consistently thought for himself as a first-hander throughout his life. He still wouldn't be a Roark, is what I'm offering as a likely hypothesis here. It would not make him into a Roark. It wouldn't necessarily make him into a great painter, even if that were his actual calling, which we don't really know. I mean, that's what he would have tried out early in life. Had he been more first-handed, he would have tried it out. Whether he would have succeeded at it and stuck at it, whole other question. And I'm just saying that change in itself would not make him into a Howard Roark, because Howard Roark has some kind of ability, great ability, genius ability, that Keating, who's not stupid by any means. I mean, he came in. Did he come in first or second in this class? He beat out. Did he beat out Schlinker?
Yeah, I think he
beat
did.
out Schlinker, right? So he's not stupid, but he's not. So let me put it another way. I like Mike the Electrician. I like that character a lot. I would, sit down for a glass of beer with Mike and Howard, even though I don't drink beer. I don't this stuff. I'd sit down with a glass of beer with those guys any day, or just with him, which is the Mike. But I don't want to be like Mike. Mike the basketball player. I know I can't be like him anyway, but I wouldn't want to be like Mike the Electrician, even though I really think he's a wonderful character, and I would be happy to be friends with him. I like him better, and maybe this is worth a moment's explanation, maybe not. I like Mike the Electrician just personally better than I would like Eddie Willers. Eddie Willers is okay. There's nothing wrong with Eddie, but there's something a little passive about Eddie, and Mike is more of an active. To me, maybe that's wrong. I don't know. You guys can toss that around if you like or not. But anyway, there is a difference between somebody that you like and recognize and respect as being entirely moral, and somebody that you would like to be like yourself. And I don't want to be like Mike, particularly.
Well, I think in different respects.
As a whole, overall. Yeah, sure. Yeah. And
but that's okay. That's not a problem. I think in
fact,
it's
not a problem. It's just I'm trying to tease out something as a difference that I don't think is emphasized in the book. Again, maybe you can find somewhere besides Mike Mike's character where it is, but where I'm trying to tease out the two things are first-handedness and creative power. And I do think it's probably the case that creative power is contingent upon a certain level, a significant level of first-handedness. But I'm not even 100% sure that you can't be crazy. I'm going to not go down that path. Anyway, I think there's a difference there that isn't, that to me, is not explicit in the book. I can't find it other than in the character of Mike.
Okay, well, there's Mike, and then you've got Stephen Mallory, and boy, is he going downhill fast. He's making those
Stephen Mallory, yeah.
He's making those kitschy baby plaques.
Yeah.
Boy, and remember what happens when Roark sees
And
that? He just throws it, which
So
basically
he's the opposite. He's the opposite case at that moment.
Yes, that's right.
Not
That's
quite,
right.
because I don't think, because after all, he comes back quickly, and there's no way in hell, or heaven or hell, that Peter Keating is coming back quickly. It's gonna, if Peter Keating started to think, it would take him a long time to get to the moral status of, a proper status of first-handedness. He wouldn't be able to do it overnight. Mallory could do it essentially turning on a dime, because he hadn't really lost that. I think that's true. Shoshana looks doubtful.
Well, it's a question of different life stages. How long would it take Wynand to straighten out the errors that he's made and to act on that? Those are, maybe there was moral questions, there's psychological questions, but I don't think it's impossible if somebody actually understands and holds on to the understanding. You see, for Mallory, it's easy comparatively, because Roark's right there, and Roark is sort of in an adjacent field, and
But I say with Keating, I don't think you could do it, because there's the thing that James describes so wonderfully in the chapter in Principles on Habit, the flywheel of habit. You can't just stop that thing. The habits that you built up over your lifetime. There is no free will is not an unlimited faculty. It was like all other faculties. It has everything else there is. It has an identity, has limits, and you cannot suddenly, by act of free will, change your whole history of habit. It's going to take, for Peter Keating, if he could do it, and I guess I would say it would be possible. It would take time and effort, considerable time and effort, and yet even so, even were he to do that, were he to have done that earlier, I would say, that would not bring him up to the creative status of a Howard Roark.
Yeah, wouldn't make him a genius, but he could still. Well,
there's an issue here.
Galt explains all of this very well in his speech. Whoever you are within the sound of my voice, it's not too late. It's not too late to make a better choice. It's not too late to be a human being. But for that, you need to get rid of the rags of centuries and all your bad ideas, and just stand naked in the face of reality and say, I am, therefore I'll think. So
this brings up.
I think that's good advice. I think he's very persuasive, and he also, speaking of the genius thing, he says, live within the limits of your knowledge and keep expanding it to the limits of your life. Start now. Yeah.
This brings up something that, again, if we get the right guests, I would like to come back to, is the more generalized form of the notion of the blank slate, of the tabula rasa. I mean, in its strictest sense, that blank slate is about ideas, innate ideas, and I personally have no qualms in agreeing that there are no innate ideas. Of course, there are people that argue that there are, but I think those are wrong. But in a broader sense, could there be things innate? Let's say even genetic. Let's say genetically about things concerning temperament, personality variables, and certainly intelligence. I think that's there may be some people out there some objectivists who say no, to that. And I don't know. Anyway, that's a topic. That's really a scientific topic.
Yeah, but that's not a moral. But the
Would not be a
moral.
moral question. Will not be a moral question.
Right. Yeah. The
Yeah.
moral question is that here you are.
Yeah.
You know, you've got a mind, you use it, you've got a chance, you've got a choice, you're in charge. These things are true for everybody and at any moment. I mean, I think Galt's right, it's not too late.
I think it's worth bringing up the issue of forgiveness here. What one can forgive oneself. And if I think of Lyman, before he betrayed Roark, I think he could have forgiven himself. But after he betrayed Roark, I don't believe he could have forgiven himself.
Well, but he doesn't care. That's not what Roark basically makes it clear. That's not about betraying me. It's about betraying himself. That's what. Yeah.
He betrays himself by betraying Roark.
Yes.
That's the means by which he achieves that. So is it impossible to come back from that? Is that just some kind of absolute impossibility?
I mean, nobody died. Yeah, no, nobody died. And
it's a question. I mean, the book does seem to present Light End as being beyond at the end as being beyond redemption.
Right. Well, that's the way he thinks, because you remember the way part 3 starts. He's pointing a gun at his temple, and then he decides not to die today because of the way that he's facing his life in this gray spirit. And then when he gives into the board, he had not pulled the trigger then, he was pulling it now. Right. So that's the way he thinks he's dying, I guess. But it's not true. That doesn't make it true.
But is it true? I guess I'm asking Bob now.
No, I think it's one's own self-assessment.
Okay, so you have his assessment is that he's beyond redemption. Is that his assessment?
Yes.
And how do you arrive at that assessment? I'm not. What do you have to believe that you're past redemption? It's hard for me to.
Actually, the better you are, the worse you've done, the easier it is to reach such a conclusion.
Say that again one more time. That was interesting. Like the better you are,
that is, the more you are really in touch with reality and what genuine values are. And the worse you have betrayed those values, the easier it is to decide that you're beyond redemption. So somebody who doesn't value, somebody who really does not grasp values, can forgive himself a lot more easily than somebody who does grasp values.
Yes, yeah, but that's all kind of phony. That would be kind of phony.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, well, maybe that's a good thing to segue into Clubhouse.
Well, let me make
Steve.
In the chat, we've been asked to give the location. Sorry, I have the locations from Shoshana's Kindle of James, but which version? Because Kindles are specific to the versions, and
well, it's I think that if you look you can get the hard copy of Principles of Psychology, and it's be in volume 2, the chapter on will.
Will, yeah, I put that already in the.
Yeah, that ought to be on Gutenberg too.
Yeah, it's in the public domain. If anybody wants more specifics, if Shoshana is going to be in Clubhouse, that's a question for Shoshana. Will you be there for a little?
Yeah, but I don't have my books in my hands right now.
Yeah. It's a hard thing to
locate. Talks to teachers. Let me just take a quick moment and say something about these books. Principles of Psychology is is William James's magnum opus, and is 1890. It's 2 volumes. There are many good chapters. Most of the good chapters are in volume 2, but not all. Not all. And there are some chapters that can be ignored. The ones that get into neurophysiology are, of course, 150 years out of date, or whatever we're up to now. Maybe not quite that, but they're way out of date. But the stuff on habit and will and attention and some other things is still worth reading. It's very good. It's mostly in volume 2. That should be available from Gutenberg as a free, electronic copy. Talks to Teachers was written about 10 years later, roughly.
1899.
Okay, 9 years later. You can watch out if you're sitting next to Shoshana, you're going to be accurate. Anyway, it's written somewhat later, and it was so he's had a little more time to think about things a little more, and it was written with particularly to talk to teachers. It talks to teachers, so he's making a lot of effort to make it understandable. Now, James is a great writer. I think he's better than his brother, Henry James, the novelist, but that's a matter of opinion, maybe. Anyway, he's a very good writer in any event, but especially in Talks to Teachers, it's very straightforward. I thought there's a chapter on will, which 15. I had in my head as chapter 11, but maybe it isn't.
15, I think.
That's the chapter on bankruptcy, isn't it? No, that's a different book. That's a different book. Okay.
15.
Okay. So anyway, there's a chapter on will. The whole chapter is worth reading, but it's the kind of the second half where most of the stuff that we've been talking about, most of that is. Now, I'm not sure that the heroic mind material, that's from Principles, right?
Right. Volume 2.
Where did you get that was in the chapter on will also.
Yeah,
that's a long chapter.
It's like pages 5-7, like I wrote down is pages 578 to 579 in the Dover. It's actually it's on the sofa next to you.
Oh, okay.
I don't have it in here.
All right. Well, I'm not going to get it right now. Anyway, okay.
Well, let me say something about Galt and Roark. Galt explains. Roark explains in the vernacular of an architect. Talks about explaining why an honest building, like an honest man, had to be one piece and one faith. And Galt explains no breach between the mind and the body at more of a philosophical level. And so I like to think of it as a different level of abstraction or a different vernacular.
Yeah, that's fair.
All. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, Galt wouldn't make the kind of mistakes Roark makes. I mean, I don't have any argument with Galt being more advanced, because, golly, let's face it. I mean, when Roark makes a deal with Peter Keating about Cortlandt, I knew that was a bad idea. That was not going to work, because Peter Keating, he's going to do his best, but his best is terrible. He's not going to be able to do this, and so it's a mistake. But it's the kind of mistake that I don't think Galt would make. Just saying, but of course, Galt is older. That's sort of the way that the heroes go. Kira's younger, and Prometheus is a little older than Kira, and then there's Roark, and then there's Galt. Sort of, yeah. And naturally, he's used his time to improve his understanding of the world. So he's got more to contribute and about thinking, and so on. But Roark isn't just someone who stands firm. He's someone who stands. Well, that's it. We got a song, right? Stand by your mind. Okay. Yeah. Stand by your mind.
And hold fast.
And Galt's mentor was Axton, whereas Roark's mentor was who? Nobody.
Cameron, I guess you could say. I suppose. Yeah. Okay, well, that's good. I think we should
wrap up and meet everybody over at Clubhouse. So,
thank you very much, Dr. Knapp. That was fabulous.
That was an absolutely fabulous demonstration of Howard Roark as a thinker. Thank you,
Thank
Shoshana.
you. Oh, thanks
And
for
we will, sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. Just thanks for being here.
Okay. So thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Razi, for allowing us on your platform. And we'll see you over at Clubhouse for more discussion. That's a wrap.